Hi, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. You may remember that at the end of the last episode, I said that before getting into Plato, I'd like to take a look at this play by Euripides. And that's what I'll be doing today, partly because, as the title of this episode suggests, I find it probably the most powerful play ever written. And partly because, as I'll discuss later in this episode, by articulating a problem for which it gives no real solution, it, in a sense, almost prophesizes Plato's theory of love by expressing so powerfully the need for something like it. You might also remember that last episode I quoted the great 20th century Irish classical scholar E.R. Dodds, whose book, The Greeks and the Irrational, challenged this, in a way, stereotype of Greek culture that we often find as thoroughly humanistic and rationalistic culture. One of the reasons why I find the play so powerful is that it expresses so powerfully the kind of Greek irrationalism Dodds was so fascinated by. And in fact, I'll be sharing today some thoughts Dodds had about this particular play. It's called the Bacchae, and it's about the phenomenon of monadism and the god Dionysus. Another name for Dionysus is Bacchus, and so his followers were also called Bacchae. Anyway, in an obvious sense, monadism seems remote from us because it's so very primal. It seems actually the pure expression of the primal in human nature. You couldn't get further from rational humanism. The Maenads in Greek mythology, and in this play, which is set deep in Greece's mythological past, are the female followers of Dionysus. The name Maenad comes from a Greek verb meaning to rave or be insane. It's where our word manic our word manic has the same root, actually, as Maenad. When we're taught about Dionysus in school today, we learn he was the god of wine, but his sphere was really much wider than that. I think it would be fairer to call him the god of urge, of ecstasy, and wild abandon, as Dodds writes. To the Greeks of the classical age, Dionysus was not solely, or even mainly, the god of wine. He is dendrites, or endendros, the power in the tree. He is antheos, the blossom bringer, carpios, the fruit bringer, phleos, or phleos, the abundance of life. His domain is, in Plutarch's words, the whole of the hygra physis, the moisture of nature. Not only the liquid fire in the grape, but the sap thrusting in a young tree, the blood pounding in the veins of a young animal, all the mysterious and uncontrollable tides that ebb and flow in the life of nature. The followers of Dionysus worshipped him in ways that might seem startling to us today. Their rites were called orgia. This is where we get the word orgy, though again the sphere of activity is wider than what we'd associate with the word today. The older custom is that this was a rite that would take place in the mountains, though at around the time of Euripides and Plato there was a trend toward groups of people, men and women, celebrating Dionysus together in private. But anyway, the Maenads attempted through dancing and intoxication to reach a state of what we might today call ego loss. Or I suppose, as Freud would call it, expansion of the ego. At any rate, there's a loss of a sense of self as opposed to another. The point was to become, as the Greeks said, entheos, full of the god. This is actually where we get the word enthusiasm. And in this state, they seem to have practiced all kinds of activities that seem irrational to us today. including something called homophagia, the tearing apart and devouring of an animal, as well as sexual indulgence. It seems the Greeks considered the ego loss of intoxication and all these activities a kind of purification, catharsis, as they put it, that relieved followers of Dionysus of that particularly human sense of existential alienation that I've been talking about so much in this series. The prophet Tiresias, whom I mentioned last time, shows up in this play also and comments on the intoxication that Dionysus brings. When mortals drink their full of wine, the sufferings of our unhappy race are banished. Each day's troubles are forgotten in sleep. There is no other cure for sorrow. This also explains another of Dionysus' fears, which might seem unrelated. You may have learned at some point that he was also the god of the theater. And if you're like me, you thought, those two things seem unrelated, wine and the theater. But acting actually also, in a way, involves a kind of ego loss. There's a flow state in which one sort of becomes the other. So it could be that there's the connection. This is what I think Dodds also speculates. But what I think most makes Maenadism so fascinating, really, is that there's also, alongside all this primitivism, something almost modern about it, or something that we moderns can at least quite deeply relate to, I think. If you've watched many of the videos in this series up to now, you'll know that a big theme of it is this problem of existential alienation, the sense that we thinking beings have of being cut off from the world, both the external world and the internal world of our feelings. I've mentioned that although this term existential alienation is, of course, a modern one, the condition itself is really universal to human life. It crosses cultures and eras. I think what's changed over time is the way we articulate the condition in our thoughts and words. And so in the last episode, I talked a lot about how you can't resist this feeling that existential alienation is symbolized through ancient Greek religion and literature. And it's also occasionally verbalized in terms of this inner struggle between reason and passion. There seems to be a part of us, our feelings, you could say, which confronts the reasoning ego sometimes as a blind, irrational, and potentially destructive other. Existential alienation is experienced as a kind of inner dividedness. I think one thing that typifies modernity, modern humanism, is this idea that the problem isn't actually this irrational or apparently irrational part of us in itself, but rather the disconnect between it and the reasoning ego, the sense that each is incomplete without the other. One has abstraction with the power that gives us to control, but the other is a source of this inner vitality. I'm thinking, for example, of the B region that we saw with William James, this wellspring of a kind of unconscious wisdom and primal energy. I think, for example, what the idea of character development in modern fiction comes down to, really, is the resolution of an inner conflict between reason and feeling. And we see this also in Freud, of course, the development of psychotherapy, the goal of which, you could say, is to reconcile the ego and the id, to resolve conflict between them by raising the unconscious to consciousness. I think this idea that the problem is not the feeling self, but its relationship with the thinking self, is one that we people of the modern age imagine ourselves to have discovered, and that we're kind of proud of, actually. And we've reached out for and found, apparently, new ways of trying to heal this rift by making space for, you could say, Dionysus, for that feeling, instinctual self, especially with the increasing rejection of other forms of communal ego loss, like religion in the West, and totalitarianism, which we hope we've been rejecting. Through this we've been trying to heal it by making space for Dionysius through this triad I mentioned a few episodes ago of sex, drugs, and rock and roll since the 60s. Though the study of ancient religious practices, like those associated with Dionysus, of course, show it that these are really just the reinvention of ancient practices. So Dionysus comes back with the decline of Christianity, I think you could say, or at least with attendance in churches. Although there's also a sense for Dionysus to reappear in Christianity itself, in Pentecostalism and charismatic Christian movements generally. So he's kind of popping up everywhere. Anyway, in the Bacchae Pentheus, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the Bacchae before I get into that. So it tells this legend of how the cult of the god Dionysus came to the Greek city of Thebes. But it's also a tale of repression, ego loss, as we mentioned, violence, denial, and finally recognition or acceptance. And like all the Greek tragedies, there's something mesmerizing about the way these themes are conveyed in the traditional symbolism of Greek myth, about how rich these symbols are. Anyway, here's the plot. Pentheus, the king of Thebes, angrily resists a stranger who comes bringing a strange cult and practices into his city. Pentheus is a rationalist in the skeptical tradition. He wants to reduce this cult to natural causes. He's proud in his ability to get to the bottom of things. And he says near the beginning of the play, "I hear of strange mischief in this city, that the women have left our homes in fictitious, ecstatic rites and flit about on the thick-shaded mountains, honoring the new god Dionysus, whoever he is, with their dancing. They set up full wine bowls in the middle of their assemblies and sneak off, one here, one there, to tryst in private with men." And he goes on, and finally he resolves, "I will quickly put an end to this damnable reveling." He's enraged when the stranger defies his questioning by answering him in riddles, and he imprisons him. But the stranger miraculously escapes, and Pentheus's palace miraculously burns down. Meanwhile, Pentheus's mother Agave has joined a group of Maenads worshipping Dionysus in the mountains. Like all Greek tragedies, this play has a chorus, and this one is a group of Bacchae, followers of Dionysus. And when they originally performed, the chorus would not just sing, but dance. Their song gives us an amazing window into the appeal of this cult. I'm going to read some sections of it. "O blessed the man who, happy in knowing the gods' rites, makes his life pure and joins his soul to the worshipful band, performing Bacchic rites upon the mountains, with cleansing." The Greek word is katharmos, which is related to the word catharsis. "With cleansing the gods approve. He performs the sacred mysteries." The Greek word is orgia, of Mother Cybele, who's sort of an earth mother, of the mountains. And then a bit later, they sing, Welcome is the god when on the mountains he leaves the coursing covens and falls to the ground, his holy garment of fawn skin about him, in pursuit of the shed blood of the slain goat, the glad meal of raw flesh. The ground runs with milk, runs with wine, runs with the nectar of bees. So there's this kind of harmony with nature. And there are even some accounts of maenads, mythical accounts of maenads suckling wild animals. Amidst his ecstatic cries, he calls, "On Bacchantes, on you Bacchantes, pride of the river Tmolus," that's where the cult is supposed to have originated, "that runs with gold. Sing Dionysius' praises to the deep roaring drums, making ecstatic cries to the god of ecstasy with Phrygian shouts." Also, Phrygia is also where it's supposed to have come from, and exclamations. And the lovely pipe shrills, all holy, its holy songs in concert with those who go to the mountain, Hence in joy, like a colt with its grazing mother, the bacchant leaps and gambols on nimble legs. So based on reports of what these maenads are up to, Pentheus decides he wants to see for himself. And the stranger takes him there. When they arrive, the stranger reveals himself as Dionysius, surprise, surprise, and points out the intruder to the maenads, egging them on to punish him. The maenads see Pentheus, and they, including his mother, tear him to pieces, believing him to be a lion. It's a shocking scene because it lays bare the terrifying potential, I think, of the Dionysiac. That same power to dehumanize the other that we saw with the modern Dionysianism of totalitarianism. And generally, as we saw with current day neuroscientific researches into ego loss. You might remember that neuroscientist talked about, even the neuroscientist who was enthusiastic about the potential of psilocybin to treat depression was also concerned about the effect of drugs like this to take away the brain's power to test reality temporarily. So this is what happened next, in the words of a messenger who relays the news to Cadmus. His mother was the priestess and began the killing, hurling herself upon him. He, however, wrenched his headdress from his hair so that poor Agave would recognize him and not kill him. He put his hand to her cheek and said, "It's me, mother, Pentheus, the son you bore in Echion's house. Have pity on me, mother. I have sinned, but do not kill your son." But her mouth dripped foam and her eyes rolled. She was not in her right mind, but possessed by the Bacchic god. And his entreaty did not move her. Taking his right hand in her grip and planting her foot against the poor man's flank, she tore out his arm at the shoulder, using a strength not her own, but put in her hands by the god. And more blood and gory description follows. Agave returns to Thebes still possessed, carrying her son's head as a trophy. Cadmus, her father, is able to break the trance state that she's in, and she realizes what she's done. It's a haunting moment because there's a moment where she looks at it, but she's still in denial, and she says something like, "Oh, it's a lion's head." Then the stranger appears in his true form as Dionysus and basically curses everyone. Agave and her sisters are exiled, and Cadmus and his wife are to be turned into snakes and lead a barbarian army to plunder Greece. And for us, it's perhaps kind of hard to understand why Cadmus and his wife are punished. But this is one of the mysteries of the play, and I think it's also part of the mystery of ancient culture. Anyway, another thing that's fascinating about the play that I also wanted to mention that you might find interesting is actually this odd resemblance Dionysus seems to bear, at least in some ways, to the Jesus of the Gospels. He's a God incarnate in human form with a throng of devoted followers. His inquisition by Pentheus resembles Pontius Pilate's questioning of Jesus. He miraculously breaks out of prison as the resurrected Jesus breaks out of the tomb. There's a transfiguration at the end when he's revealed in his true form. And of course, there's this theme of ritual eating, although it's not exactly parallel. There are all sorts of theories about this, which you could Google. I'm not sure how well researched they all are. There are also oddly Dionysian Christian hymns, some of which are very old. There's this old Christmas carol you might know called "Tomorrow Shall Be My Dancing Day," which celebrates Jesus as a kind of leader of the dance. And then there's this hymn from the 60s, Lord of the Dance, which was inspired by that earlier hymn. Anyway, all that would be interesting to explore, but it's sort of unfortunately outside the scope of this episode, but I thought I'd mention it. So anyway, what to make of the ending of this tragedy where everybody's punished, except the god Tiresias also is not punished? There are no winners here. Euripides seems to be suggesting that Pentheus-like repression, seeing Dionysus, or you might say the id, simply as an alien other, destroys everything, not just oneself, but it spreads ruin. It spreads ruin outward. Dodds writes, to resist Dionysus is to repress the elemental in one's own nature. The punishment is the sudden, complete collapse of the inward dikes when the elemental breaks through perforce and civilization vanishes. So I think this would have been written in the 50s, just a few years after the Second World War. The moral of the Bacchae is that we ignore at our peril the demand of the human spirit for Dionysiac experience. For those who, and this interestingly, a decade or so before sex, drugs, and rock and roll. For those who do not close their minds against it, such experience can be a deep source of spiritual power and eudaimonia, that's the Greek word for a deep happiness. But those who repress the demand in themselves or refuse its satisfaction to others transform it by their act into a power of disintegration and destruction, a blind, natural force that sweeps away the innocent with the guilty. I don't think the play is entirely without hope. Toward the end, shortly before Pentheus's death, the chorus seems to sum up what you might call the moral of the story. He with unjust purpose and lawless temper toward your rights, Bacchus, and those of your mother, set out with maddened heart and crazed wits, thinking to master by force what cannot be mastered. Death will be the chastener of his purposes. But to be unhesitating toward the gods and act as mortals should means a life without grief. I feel no grudging resentment against those who pursue cleverness in due measure. But it is other qualities, great and manifest, that lead the life of mortals to success. To practice purity and godliness all the long day and into the night, honoring the gods, and banishing all customs that lie outside justice. The moral is summed up a little later in the play more succinctly, I think, at the end of the speech of the messenger who brings the news of Pentheus's death to the palace. He says simply, "The best thing of all is to practice moderation and worship the gods." So we're talking about the traditional ancient Greek virtues of moderation and piety. It's a piety that's different from what we in the modern West today would think of or assume to be piety. It's one that includes making room for all the gods, including Dionysus. There's a sense, though, in which this is not, I think, really actionable advice. How can you really tell whether you're acting moderately or immoderately? And I think more importantly, I wonder, has there really been a meaningful reconciliation here? The chorus says it doesn't resent human cleverness, but it expects unhesitating faith from humanity. In other words, it proposes a place for the Dionysiac in human life, but I'm not sure if it really gives place to this other side of natural human spirit of inquiry, which it seems must be frightened into submission by the prospect of nightmarish violence and ruin. I think there's really an impasse here. And so I think we see both of these really at their extremes. We see Dionysus, this destructive power of Dionysus is released in response to a thinking ego that is it's conceived only as taking this very hard line, as being purely resistant to the other, purely skeptical, hostile. So there just doesn't really, it depicts these two sides as without a lot of hope for reconciliation beyond this sort of formula of moderation and piety. I think there's really a kind of impasse here. And so I think the most powerful thing of all about this play, actually, what I'm saying might be familiar to you if you've been watching this series. It reminds us, perhaps, of a similar impasse we find in our own time, this dilemma we face today, of having no way to reconcile the human desires for truth and oneness. I think it really haunts us communally and individually, and I think that's why reading the Bacchae today is like a punch in the gut. So Euripides lived around 480 BC to around 406 BC. Plato lived from around 427 to 348. So there's an overlap there. And Plato lived in Athens as Euripides' plays were being performed. Euripides then takes us to Plato's time, and he, in a way, delivers onto Plato's lap this deep dilemma of human desire and how to solve it. This dead end with no apparent way out. And we'll see what Plato does with that in upcoming episodes. Thanks again for watching, and see you next time.